What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Anecdotes and Observation, Episode 3. That's Ayo or Ayo! My name is Eric Helms. Happy to be back. Today we're going to be talking about the inherent title of this series, The Limitations of Anecdotes and Observation. Now, obviously, I value anecdotes and observational knowledge, or I wouldn't have made this series. So the question is, why am I talking about the limitations? Well, to answer that, first we need to talk about scientific evidence and why that's often paraded around as the most important thing to use for knowledge in our evidence-based fitness community. So when I say evidence-based, what I basically mean is the concept that we should be using science to inform our decisions to some degree. Now, ideally, evidence-based practice is based on a model where you have three-pronged approach. You're using not only scientific research that you're engaging with to get the closest idea to the truth of what's best for training and nutrition, but also your clients or your own personal experiences, preferences, and individual differences. And all those things come together. So you have the three-pronged approach of your experience, the preferences and the individual differences of the client, and science that come together to make what we call quote-unquote evidence-based practice. Now, many people will make the mistake of just focusing on research. And because I call this a mistake because they don't understand the limitations of science. Now, this is a drum I've been beating for years, probably since 2011 or 12, but I've got to keep beating it because I continually see people making this mistake. So research, science-based evidence, is inherently flawed. And I wouldn't say flawed, but it's inherently limited in the fact that it is based on group-based research and reporting averages, and rarely does it give you individual differences or does it tell you what is best for you to do. It tells what is best for a group within a given demographic. So you do a study, you sample from the same population, we'll say resistance-trained women from the age of 20 to 40, and you will then have them meet certain inclusion criteria for strength, how long they've been training, what menstrual cycle phase they're in, and whether or not they're using anabolic steroids, and then you'll give them this certain training intervention, cardio intervention, and they have to meet these food criteria, and then you see, I'm going to change one thing and what was better. Now, that's great, and that will tell you about, in general, what is better most of the time, especially if you find a statistically significant difference. And it will tell you the probability of what the likelihood that is, in fact, the case is. And then when you have multiple studies, maybe even a meta-analysis, you can be pretty damn sure that if they all find the same thing, that's probably generally true. Now, what you can't do with that is then go on Instagram, find a female natural pro bodybuilder who is not following that protocol, even though she fits that demographic, and say, hey, you're doing it wrong. Because you have no idea whether or not she might be one of those people who the group mean average change does not apply to. Because in every study I've ever seen done, there are people in either group who respond in the opposite direction or in a much different magnitude than what the group average was. Now, sometimes this is just simply due to them not following the criteria of the study, not actually meeting the inclusion or exclusion criteria, or some type of error in data collection. But just as often, it's because they're actually just different in either the biology, physiology, or their psychology, so that intervention is not the answer for them. It's not the best option, and they should be doing something else. So the misapplication of science is when you don't understand the limitations, that it's about the big picture, get in the ballpark, broad brushstrokes, not the fine detail work or the putting on the green. It's that long drive, right? It's trying to give you those big picture answers to get you in the ballpark of what's right. And then from there, the only data that matters is tracking your individual data systematically while paying attention and trying things multiple times over and over to see if you get the same effect, or taking that same systematic approach with your clients. So that needs to be said, even though this episode is actually talking about the limitations of anecdotes, because to understand the limitations of science are required before we talk about the limitations of anecdotes. Because once you've met the limits of what scientific knowledge can give you, you should be relying on anecdotes and experience. But then you have to know what are the limitations of anecdotes, experience, and observational knowledge. Now, we're probably well aware of some of those basic concepts because that's the whole reason why we focus on science. That's probably why you listen to me. You probably value science for some reason, and you know that certain anecdotal knowledge is not that helpful. For example, your average person out there who first gets engaged in bodybuilding will probably find the most jacked person or lean person or whatever person they want to look like or be like on Instagram and then copy what they do. And you'll see thousands of people getting decent results following this person's training program or nutrition program, and while that person seems to be getting great results. Now, if you argue with these people, most of the time they'll tell you, well, of course it makes sense to do it. I'm following insert name of world champion, Olympian, fitness model, etc. It's working great for them, and they're the best, so obviously that's the best program. But when you look at it like factually, you go, well, hold on, there's thousands of people getting poor gains and one person getting great gains in this program. This actually sounds like a really shitty program. But that's not the way anecdotes and observation and kind of group social norms work. People do illogical things, and that's why you go, you know what, damn it, I'm going to follow science, because that's not the way to go. And that's great. However, there is such a thing as useful anecdotes and useful observations, hence this series. Because if you're able to take systematic notes and, like I said, systematically track things while paying attention, you can get some very good data on individuals or groups of people, and you can make consistent changes that help people get to the highest level. Anecdotes and observations are actually how champions are made. Champions don't just look up the best meta-analytic data, follow it, and then win the world championship just because they have that in combination with genetics. Champions are made because they've paid attention to what works best for them, or they've had a coach help them do that, and they've trained hard for years. So observations and anecdotes are absolutely critical. However, they have limitations, and limitations that are a little more insidious than the ones I just talked about at the start. So for example, I'll use Team 3DMJ. We've been on the scene for almost 10 years now. We've been training as a group collectively probably a couple thousand clients. And if you listen to our podcast, if you read our blogs, if you listen to us talk on other people's podcasts, or if you have gone to one of our seminars, we use anecdote and experiential knowledge a lot because that's what coaches do. And that's the best thing to do when you reach the limits of science. However, as we become more and more popular, we've probably become more reinforced in believing that those anecdotes are indeed true. Now, why would that be? Well, as we become more popular, we're going to get more people self-selecting who want to work with us. So when we were an unknown quantity, people might hear about us and they would look us up and they go, sure, I'll try them. They have affordable prices. That guy looks jacked. Sure, I'll have him do my training or nutrition for a while. They have no preconceived notion of what we're going to do before they come in. Some people didn't even read our website. They just heard the good word, sent us an email, and we're off to the races. Now, fortunately, that was the foundation of how we developed our experiential knowledge, from people coming to us without a strong bias. But now in the year 2018, people come to us with a very specific idea in their head of what it's going to be like to work with us, why they want to work with us, and what it's probably going to be like. And the people who would think, you know what, I've tried that previously, that didn't work for me, or I really don't like their style, they're not going to work with us. They're going to work with someone else. So it's the people who have had some level of success, either in actual previous experience with our methods, or who believe in our methods who come to us that are either going to be self-selected to get success with us or get a nice placebo effect from working with us just because they think they're using the best methods possible, whether or not they actually are the best methods for that person. And what this creates is a reinforcement of our own beliefs and our own anecdotal experience. And we have to be aware of that. Now, it's not to say that our own anecdotal experience isn't true within the context of our clients. Indeed, it probably is. However, we have to be aware that when we're presenting information to the broad community, and when we're thinking about the way things work in a more general sense, that those anecdotal, observational, experiential knowledge cues that we've learned may not apply outside of our own community of athletes and followers. So that's one thing. So in addition to that, there's also limitations within groups. So for example, social groups create their own limitations. One example I will give you is bodybuilders. In bodybuilding culture, working extremely hard is seen as the badge of honor. I would even put it higher than having a great physique. If you're someone who consistently gets in the gym and gets in the kitchen and does your work, works very hard, pushes each set to the limit, and makes sure each day in the gym you've absolutely crushed it, you're going to get a lot of kudos. And you're going to be seen as someone who is part of the community. Your bros and sisters will give you that collective fist bump. Boom. You're part of the bodybuilder crew. And that's fine. I think there's value in that because to do what bodybuilders do requires a lot of hard work and a lot of effort. So it's no surprise to me that that's the main badge of honor. I'm part of that community, and that's where I trend to as well. And I would attribute a lot of my success to that, both in and outside of the world of bodybuilding. However, that does mean that there are certain elements of training that become basically non-options for changing. Now, why does this matter? Okay, well, here's something to point out. probably the most common bodybuilding frequency of training is about one times per week per muscle group. You might train 4 to 6 days a week, but each muscle group is only hit directly once. Now, why would that be for over 30 years? Well, it's probably because bodybuilders have found that to actually be the best. And there was a recent study, I think done only a few years back, that found 2/3 of bodybuilders trained each muscle group once per week, and only 1/3 trained them twice per week, but no one trained it more frequently than that. Now, this is a bit in contrast with the research that would suggest a training frequency of 2 to 3 times per week is about where you maximize the training response on a per muscle basis. So this shouldn't be new to anyone following this channel, but the best data we have now is that if you're training each muscle group at least twice per week, regardless of how many times you step in the gym, so that could be full body, or upper lower, or whatever, that is typically where you get the most advantage out of increasing your frequency. But it's certainly better, and pretty clearly better, than just training each muscle group once per week. Now, why is it that 2/3 of bodybuilders don't do this? And they've actually observed the opposite. I've frequently seen bodybuilders talk about how they experience burnout, injury, or even a plateau in their progress when they try to increase their frequency beyond once per week. This goes back to our cultural beliefs as bodybuilders. If every session has to have the intensity and the volume cranked up to 11, or either or, typically if it's a low volume program, the intensity is super high, and vice versa, then that limits the amount of frequency you can effectively do. To have a higher frequency approach be effective, and maybe even be better than a 1 times per week frequency approach, you probably need to moderate how close you train to failure, and you probably need to reduce the volume per session. But most bodybuilders, when they go to a 2 times per week frequency, will keep the same volume per session and then just do another session within the same week, effectively doubling their volume. That's not how you're supposed to do it. If they don't want to drop their volume, they don't want to not train to failure, that's not an option for them. So of course, if you can't observe something, if you can't observe yourself following a higher frequency but lower intensity, lower volume per session approach, how could you know if a higher frequency would be better? So that's one example of how not everyone, but the bodybuilding community at large is relatively blind by their own anecdotes. Yes, 30 years of bodybuilding experience would tell us that all champions tend to use a 1 times per week frequency, or somewhere no more frequently than every 4th or 5th day. But that's because they're unwilling to change certain variables that would probably be necessarily changed if they went to a higher frequency. Now, this episode isn't about frequency. It isn't about science. It is about the limitations of anecdotes and observation. And I bring them up for a specific reason. One, if you know the limitations of science, fantastic, then you're not going to be that PubMed ninja who's pissing everybody off and not really being helpful in any way. And you can move on and actually start using good quality anecdotes and observation to inform your training or your client's training once you've reached the limitations of science. Likewise, if you know the limitations of anecdotes, you can become more aware and not make errors in your decision making because you don't actually have high quality anecdotes. You don't want to be a victim to the limitations of either. So if you know the limitations, then you can do a little more self-checking, and you can assess, is this anecdote actually true in all contexts, or what context is it true in, and what do I actually not know? Because that's where there's room for advancement and learning, and potentially new avenues of growth and progress. So be aware of the limitations of both science and anecdotes. Make sure you self-check, and you will get new levels of knowledge and hopefully new levels of gains. And I will see you next time on AO!